Welcome to this Files One News special report, Exonerated, Guilty Until Proven Innocent. I'm Stone Grissom. As a former trial attorney, I spent a lot of time in courtrooms very similar to this. It's a place where justice is supposed to be dealt out fairly, judges and juries determining the guilt or innocence of those on trial. However, in some courtrooms across New York State, a surprising number of people are convicted of crimes they never committed, forced to serve time behind bars, often losing decades of their lives in the process. To date, 259 people nationwide have been exonerated through DNA testing. 28 of those people, more than 10% of all exonerations in the U.S., were wrongfully convicted in New York. Only two other states, Texas and Illinois, have had more convictions overturned by DNA. Now, 28 may not seem like a lot, but think of this. Combined, these men and women served more than 1,000 years in prison for crimes they never committed. And for every day they spent behind bars, the real criminal was allowed to roam free in our communities, often committing additional crimes. So why are so many innocent people being convicted in this state, and what are we doing about it? Over the next hour, we'll look at the issues of exonerations in New York through the eyes of those who've lived through it. Men and women who were wrongfully convicted of crimes only to be released from prison many years later. This includes the latest New York State exoneree, Frank Sterling, who was set free this past April. We traveled to his hometown of Rochester to retrace Frank's case and unite him with two other New York exonerees for the very first time.
It's hard. I struggle. It's everything. But keep your head.
We will also hear from Melissa Lulo, the daughter of Dennis Halstead, a Long Island man who served 16 years for a crime he did not commit. Melissa was only 10 when her father was incarcerated. We'll learn how Halstead's wrongful imprisonment not only changed his life, but had a huge impact on his daughter as she grew up as well. And we'll visit with Vanessa Podkin, an attorney with the Innocence Project, the leading national organization representing the wrongfully convicted. Vanessa will help us dissect the issues facing New York State and the potential steps that can be taken to avoid future wrongful convictions. During this hour, our goal is to learn from past cases of injustice and look toward future reforms and safeguards so we may never again utter those words, guilty until proven innocent. We begin in Rochester, New York, with the story of Frank Sterling and how an innocent man can confess to murder.
Yeah, you okay?
At first glance, this scene, Frank Sterling in the middle, looks simply like a distressed man being consoled. But in reality, this brief moment with Rochester area police would wind up costing Frank Sterling nearly 18 years of his life.
Well, over the 18 years, my life stopped.
Frank Sterling had, by all accounts, a typical childhood. He grew up in this house, in a quiet neighborhood in a sleepy suburb of Rochester. Did you have any siblings?
Well, two brothers, one older, one younger.
And both your parents were around?
Yep.
They were married?
They were married to my dad in 95.
And though it seemed unimportant at the time, Frank also lived down the street from this woman.
Viola Manville is a woman that lived in Hilton, New York. You know, it's a suburb in the western part of the city. And by all accounts, just a spunky, vivacious lady, late 70s, who loved to be outside, loved to walk religiously.
I knew my Viola Manville. I always took the dogs for a walk. Met her a few times on the tracks. Had general conversation, about the weather.
After graduating high school, Frank did what many young folks do. He began working, first driving a school bus, then on to trucking school. He wasn't striving for a high-profile career, just his version of the American dream. Unfortunately for Frank, that dream was about to turn into a personal nightmare. On November 29, 1988, Viola Manville was taking her daily walk along an abandoned railway bed when she was beaten to death.
Somebody confronted her on the path, beat her with possibly a BB gun, possibly a piece of wood, and fatally beat her about the head and left her there, basically under some bushes there along the trail.
This is the path where Viola Manville walked every day, and it's the same path where ultimately she was murdered. Now, originally police were looking at another person of interest, a man by the name of Mark Christie. In fact, it was rumored that Mark had even bragged to his friends about the crime. And although Frank had an airtight alibi for the time of the killing, it was Frank who ultimately confessed. Were you ever in trouble with the law
No.
up to that point?
Nope.
You ever been arrested?
Nope. Just speeding tickets.
Were you upset when you heard that she had
When I
died?
found out she got killed, yes. It's like a friend.
There was a lot of information early on that pointed away from Frank. There was no physical evidence that tied him to the crime.
And he had a solid alibi.
They actually had to change their theory of when the crime occurred in order to fit the small window of opportunity that he had available in the afternoon, whereas the victim here, Viola Manville, was like clockwork, a walker in the morning.
Matter of fact, I mean, one of the reasons Frank became a suspect was because his brother had sexually assaulted Mrs. Manville on an earlier walk some years before.
Police felt the family connection was strong enough to disregard the problems with the timeline. Despite the fact that Mark Christie couldn't account for his own whereabouts during the murder, police dismissed him as a viable suspect and remained focused on Frank Sterling.
And then a couple of years later, 1991, they decide to basically tackle it as a cold case, bring some new investigators in, and that's when they go bring Frank in to question him.
He's like, well, fine. I know I didn't do the murder, so I had no problem going down and take a polygraph.
When police picked him up, Frank had already been on the road working for 36 hours straight.
The misrepresentation was that, just come with us for a few minutes, it'll be fine, we just have to clear some stuff up. He didn't plan on being there all day or overnight. He planned on going to work in the afternoon.
But the police had other ideas.
The whole interrogation, 12 and a half hours.
What was that like, if you can put into words what it was like to be interrogated by police for a crime of a murder from someone that you missed, that you liked?
Painful.
In the end, too painful. The police used an interrogation technique called the Reed technique, a mixture of isolating a suspect and convincing him of his guilt.
The Reed technique, which is taught basically to every police officer in the country in one form or another, makes the suspect believe that it is in their best interest to admit what the cop wants them to admit. If you tell us your side of the story, we can clear this up, you can go home, things like that. So over a period of hours or days where the person is isolated and removed from their support system, they come to believe that it's actually in their best interest to admit what the cop wants them to admit to.
After 12 hours, Frank Sterling broke down and confessed. And when he did, police turned on a video camera. So for that entire 12-hour period that you were polygraphed and interrogated, none of that exists on tape.
No.
Why would you, a proven, exonerated, innocent man, science has told us beyond any doubt you did not do this crime. Why did you confess to it?
At that time, I didn't care what happened. I was just so tired.
Based solely on this confession, most of which was never recorded, Frank Sterling was convicted of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison.
When they came back with a verdict, I'd lost it.
Did you think your life was over?
Pretty much.
Did your parents attend the trial?
No. It was too painful for them. Basically destroyed my family, destroyed my dad.
Now, Frank was facing 25 years to life behind bars for a crime he never committed. Now, the Innocence Project has helped bring many cases to light, including Frank's. I recently spoke with Innocence Project attorney Vanessa Potkin at their Manhattan offices to learn why New York State has such a disproportionate number of wrongful convictions, how people can confess to crimes they never committed, and what's being done to make sure the wrong person isn't serving time. You do this work all over the country.
Yes.
You're based in New York. New York seems to have a disproportionate number of people who, at least it comes to light that they were wrongfully convicted out of the nation. Why is that? Why is it harder in New York to not get a correct conviction?
Well, I think there are a few things that separate New York from the rest of the country. First, New York was one of the first states in the nation to enact a post-conviction DNA testing statute. So inmates, convicted people in New York since the late 90s have had the right to go into court and get DNA testing. So part of it's just a matter of access. But we have some particular problems in New York as well. New York City is one of the worst places to find evidence. The evidence storage system is very archaic. It's a complete mess. There are not computerized records for old evidence. There's just handwritten pieces of paper, and if a piece of paper is lost, we've had clients who for 10 years in New York were trying to get DNA testing and were told their evidence didn't exist, and lo and behold, when someone actually physically searched, it was there. So we have some particular problems in New York City. And also New York State has been a bit behind the times in terms of enacting reforms to prevent wrongful convictions.
You know Frank Sterling. You worked on his case, right?
Yes.
He confessed to a crime that he has now been exonerated for. How does that happen? How does an innocent person confess to not just a crime, a really heinous crime?
Most of us think if we were called in by the police and accused of committing a murder or a serious crime that we would absolutely never confess. And it's very hard for kind of people to understand how this happens. But at the Innocence Project, we see that it happens way more than people think. In fact, 25% of the exoneration cases have involved people who were convicted because they falsely confessed to very serious crimes.
Wow. A quarter of the case. That's nationwide.
Yeah, it's astonishing. And there are a variety of factors that lead to false confessions. It can be a matter of age. Young people are particularly susceptible, people with any type of mental health issues. But it can be, anybody, really. The police use very good kind of coercive tactics in order to obtain confessions from people, and these tactics are so strong that they can also get innocent people to falsely confess.
What types of safeguards could be put into place to stop that type of action, a false confession, from happening?
In New York, statewide, we should be preserving evidence so long as a person's in prison. We should be keeping their evidence, not throwing it away. We should have broad access to DNA testing and other type of remedies for people who are in prison to prove innocence. We should be videotaping interrogations. In Frank Sterling's case, they did a videotape of his statement at the end, the confession. But we don't know what happened in the 12 hours that led up to that statement when he was being interrogated. We have different accounts, but we could have an objective record of what happened if interrogations were videotaped, and this should be something that's mandated statewide.
Is there a part of the country that's doing it right? I mean, are there states out there that we should be looking at as examples and models?
Well, I think that there's certain pockets or jurisdictions and different states that are doing, taking the leadership in some of these areas. For example, New Jersey taking the leadership in eyewitness ID reform. It also is not mandatory through any state law, but through court decision, they are videotaping interrogations. New Jersey, like New York, has a problem with evidence preservation, and both of these states need to pretty immediately pass some type of legislation or start to look into the problem of evidence preservation.
So, what is it like for an innocent person to serve time behind bars? Coming up, Frank Sterling takes us inside the world of a wrongfully convicted man facing the prospect of dying in prison. And later on,
Take one day at a time.
an historic meeting as 3 exonerees come together for the very first time. You're watching Exonerated, Guilty Until Proven Innocent.